The sun had barely crested over the jagged mountains when he first saw her. Dust swirled along the canyon floor, kicked up by the slow, steady hooves of a lone mare. She rode hard, but there was a grace in her flight, a quiet desperation that tugged at the very marrow of his bones. His hand tightened on the reins, heart hammering in the still morning air, and he whispered to himself, "Don't let her disappear." He'd known her for only a few weeks, yet already the thought of losing her burned like a brand. Clara, she had a way of turning the harsh frontier into a place of fragile beauty. Her auburn hair caught the light like wildfire, and when she laughed, it was as if the canyon itself bent closer to listen. But behind that beauty was sorrow, a shadow that no smile could hide. The townsfolk of Dustwood whispered about her. A widow, they said, with eyes like the storm before a summer rain. She had come to this town alone, carrying only a leather satchel and a heart burdened with secrets too heavy to share. Some claimed she had lost more than a husband, some spoke of betrayal, others of a promise broken in blood. None knew the truth, and she intended to keep it that way. He had met her at the old saloon, the one with the splintered wooden floor and the faint smell of whiskey and smoke. He had come in seeking a drink after a long ride, yet found himself seated beside her, drawn by a force he could neither name nor resist. She had been sketching on a scrap of paper, her fingers smudged with charcoal, her eyes far away in some distant memory. "Coffee?" he asked, unsure why the word had left his lips. She looked up slowly, startled, then smiled faintly. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was soft, but it carried a weight, a history he could sense but not yet understand. They spoke little at first. Words were dangerous, heavy with the past each carried. Instead, they shared silence, broken only by the creak of chairs and the occasional clatter from the bar. Yet even in that quiet, he felt a tether form between them, delicate but unbreakable. Days passed. He found himself following her at a careful distance, watching as she helped an old rancher mend his fence, or tended to a child whose mother had gone missing on the plains. She moved through the town like a whisper of hope, leaving small acts of kindness in her wake. And with every act, his heart grew more certain. He would not let her leave. Then came the storm. The clouds rolled in with an anger that matched the chaos in his chest. Rain pelted the town, turning streets into rivers of mud, and she rode out of town with little more than a glance back. The mare's hooves pounded the soaked earth, and in that instant, he knew she was running from something far darker than the storm itself. He mounted his horse, the leather saddle slicked beneath him, and rode after her. Every thought screamed to stop, to let her go, but love refused to obey. As he pushed through the whipping rain and howling wind, he caught glimpses of her silhouette ahead, framed against the cliffs like a figure of fragile defiance. She said, "Don't follow me," he muttered through gritted teeth, "but how can I let her face this alone?" The canyon opened before him, a maze of shadows and jagged stone. The wind carried her voice, or perhaps it was his imagination murmuring a warning he could not ignore. Yet he pressed on, driven by a promise he had not spoken aloud but felt deep in his soul. Finally, he saw her stop at the edge of a narrow precipice. The river below raged, dark and untamed, matching the turmoil in her eyes. She turned to him, eyes wide, fear and sorrow warring with the quiet steel of her spirit. "You don't understand," she said, voice trembling. "If you come closer, it will destroy you. Stay here, please." But he shook his head. "I can't. I won't." Every muscle in his body ached, yet he advanced, step by step, toward the woman who had become the reason for every heartbeat. For a moment, the storm seemed to pause. Time itself held its breath as they faced one another, the precipice between them more than just a drop into the churning river. It was a chasm of secrets, of past regrets, of unspoken truths, and in that silence, he realized the full weight of what he had followed her for, not just love, but the need to protect, to save, and perhaps, to redeem. Then, without warning, a gunshot echoed across the canyon. A jagged streak of flame and smoke cut through the gray sky. She stumbled, a cry tearing from her throat, and the mare reared wildly. His heart lurched. She had been trying to hide something, something he could not yet see, but whatever it was alive and dangerous, and now it had found them. He spurred his horse forward, shouting her name, but the wind swallowed it. The cliff's edge crumbled under her hooves, sending a cloud of dust and fear into the air, and then silence. The canyon swallowed everything, leaving only the distant roar of the river and the bitter taste of dread on his tongue. He dismounted, knees trembling, eyes scanning the jagged rocks below, praying that somehow she had survived. But all that met him was the storm, relentless and unyielding, whispering the warning she had begged him to heed. And yet, somewhere deep inside, he knew he could not give up. She had asked him to leave. But his love, stubborn, foolish, unrelenting, refused. The storm raged, a wild, brutal symphony of wind and rain that turned the canyon into a churning maelstrom. He clung to the edge, the ground a treacherous mix of mud and gravel slipping beneath his boots. His heart hammered against his ribs as he peered down into the shadowed abyss below. Somewhere in that chaos, she had fallen, or perhaps she was hiding, but the river's furious roar swallowed all certainty, all sound, all hope. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at his throat, but he forced it down, swallowing it like a bitter pill. Fear was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not now. Not when she was out there. Then, his eyes caught a flash of auburn, tangled in the scrub and brambles clinging desperately to the canyon wall, barely moving. Relief surged through him, a powerful wave that was almost immediately tempered by a new, colder realization: she was injured. Without a second thought, without a moment's hesitation, he began his descent down the treacherous slope. Every rock threatened to betray him, to send him tumbling into the same abyss he feared had claimed her. She was small, almost fragile, yet as he drew closer, he saw it. In her eyes, there was a stubborn, unyielding fire that refused to be extinguished, even amidst the pain and the biting cold. Clara, his voice broke through the storm's howl, a raw, desperate sound. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, her lips curved into a faint, grim smile. "I told you to stay back," she whispered, her voice hoarse, her teeth chattering from the cold and the shock. I can't let you." "You don't get to decide that," he interrupted, his voice firm, as he knelt beside her. He pressed a hand to the gash on her arm, his touch gentle despite the urgency. "Not when it matters like this." "Not ever." Her eyes flickered, and in their depths, he saw a storm of unspoken emotions: fear, gratitude, and a deep, aching loneliness. He'd seen that look before, in the rare, quiet moments when she allowed her guard to fall. But now, with the storm battering them and the canyon threatening to swallow them whole, it was more potent, more heartbreaking than ever. He lifted her carefully, her small frame surprisingly light, and held her against his chest as he began the arduous climb back toward safer ground. Each step was a battle against the slick mud and the relentless wind. Yet, every single step brought them closer together, closer to survival, closer to the unspoken truth that had been simmering between them like a dormant fire, just waiting for a spark. Finally, they reached a narrow ledge where the wind seemed to relent, offering just enough of a reprieve for them to catch their breaths. He lowered her gently to the ground, and for the first time, they allowed themselves a moment of quiet stillness. The storm still raged around them, a chaotic orchestra of nature's fury, but in that fragile pause, he could see her fully, not just the woman who had run, but the woman who had captured his very soul. "I didn't want you to follow me," she admitted, her voice trembling, laced with a sorrow that cut him deep. I have a past you couldn't survive." He shook his head, his eyes fierce, unwavering. "Everyone has a past, Clara. It doesn't scare me. You scare me, yes, but not your past." "Not you." Her gaze softened, and for a fleeting heartbeat, he thought she might finally let him in, might finally tear down the wall she had built so high. But then her eyes darkened, storm clouds mirroring the tempest that raged above them. "They're coming," she whispered, her words almost lost in the wind, a chilling premonition. "The ones who took my husband, they'll come for me. And for you too, if you stay." A cold dread ran down his spine. He was no stranger to danger. He'd faced outlaws, gunmen, and wild animals, but he'd never felt a fear that made his chest tighten the way her words did. Whoever they were, they sounded relentless, and they were about to test the very limits of their courage, of his devotion. "We'll face them together," he said, the words simple, but the promise absolute. "I won't leave you. Not now, not ever." For just a moment, a glimmer of hope sparked in her eyes, a fragile light against the encroaching darkness of her fear. Then, without warning, a figure appeared across the canyon ledge, silhouetted against the stormy sky. A man, tall and imposing, a gun held casually in his hand, moving with the calm, deadly precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Clara's eyes widened in terror. "I told you," she murmured, panic finally cracking her voice. "You shouldn't be here." "I told you," he replied, his own voice steady despite the thundering storm and the pounding in his chest. "I couldn't leave. I wouldn't leave." "Not you." The man stepped closer, the rain washing over him like a baptism of menace. He spoke, his voice low, almost courteous, yet it carried a threat as sharp as a freshly honed knife. "You shouldn't have come here, stranger. She belongs to us, and you don't belong to her." Anger flared in him, raw and fierce, a fire fueled by love and desperation. He stood taller, planting his feet firmly even as the mud threatened to pull him down. "You leave her alone. Whatever your business is with her, it doesn't touch her not anymore." Clara gasped, her hand clutching his arm, a desperate anchor. "You don't understand, they won't stop." "I understand enough," he interrupted, his eyes locked on the man across the chasm, his heart a war drum in his ears. "And I'll make sure they do." The standoff stretched, the air crackling with tension, the storm amplifying every frantic heartbeat. Time seemed to slow to a single beat, a single breath, a single whispered prayer. And then the first gunshot cracked through the air, startling in its sudden, violent finality. He dove, pulling Clara down behind a jagged boulder as bullets splintered the stone around them and rain hissed against their faces. Her terrified gasp was a ghost against his chest, but beneath it, he felt something else, an unspoken trust, a bond forged in the crucible of wind, rain, and raw fear. The man shouted, his voice a torrent of rage and fury spilling into the storm, but he held firm, shielding her with his body, moving with a precision born not of training but of sheer, unyielding determination. He couldn't lose her. Not now. Not when he had finally found a reason to fight, to stand, to risk everything he had. Hours or perhaps only minutes passed in a dizzying blur of mud, rain, and heartbeats. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, an eerie silence fell, broken only by the distant roar of the river. The man had retreated, or perhaps he had simply underestimated the bond between them, the strength of a love he couldn't comprehend. Clara leaned into him, her body trembling, rain soaking her hair and clothes. Her eyes, when she looked up at him, were filled with a profound gratitude and something deeper, something he felt resonate in his very soul. "You followed me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the river's roar. "I did," he replied, his voice soft as he brushed wet strands of auburn hair from her face. "And I'll follow you anywhere, always." She closed her eyes, finally letting the immense weight of fear and relief wash over her. For the first time in days, perhaps even in years, she allowed herself to believe that someone could care enough, fight enough, love enough to face the storm right there with her. But even as they held each other in that fragile embrace, both knew the danger was not gone. Far from it. Secrets had been revealed, and a hunter was still on her trail. The canyon had tested their courage, and while they had survived this first battle, the war was far from over. And in the distance, the thunder rumbled, echoing across the jagged cliffs like a solemn promise or a chilling warning that the next chapter of their ordeal would come with even higher stakes, and demand an even greater price. The storm had passed, but a new one was just beginning to gather. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what happens next. See you in the next video. The storm had passed, leaving the canyon washed in silver light as dawn crept over the jagged peaks. Mist clung to the river below, curling around boulders and trees like the ghost of the night before. Clara leaned against him, shivering, not from cold but from the raw, unspoken fear that had shadowed them since she fled the town. Yet there was also a quiet peace, fragile and fleeting, resting between them in the early morning glow. "We can't stay here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They'll come back," he nodded, brushing the mud from her coat, his fingers lingering a moment too long over the warmth of her hand. "Then we move, together. Wherever they follow, we'll face it together. No more running alone." Her eyes met his, and for the first time she let herself truly see him, not just the man who had chased her through the storm, but the one who had refused to abandon her, who had placed her above every danger, every fear. The weight of her past, the grief she had carried for so long, began to lift, softened by the steady strength of someone willing to fight for her heart. They rode slowly, keeping low, winding through hidden trails and narrow passes. Every mile they put between themselves and Dustwood, the tension in her shoulders eased slightly. But he could tell she was still guarding something, a secret too heavy to speak aloud. And he knew, deep in his soul, that the only way they could survive this ordeal and perhaps find peace was to confront it together. By nightfall, They found a small clearing on the edge of a pine forest, a place shielded from sight and sound. He built a fire while she tended to their meager supplies, the crackle of the flames a small comfort against the lingering tension of the day. When she finally sat beside him, he offered her a quiet smile. "We've survived worse. We'll survive this too." Her lips curved faintly, and for a moment, the weight of fear lifted completely. I don't even know your name," she admitted softly. He chuckled, a low, warm sound that mingled with the whispering pines. "Cole, my name's Cole." "Cole," she repeated, testing the syllables as if tasting something foreign yet welcome. "I'm Clara." The firelight danced across her face, illuminating the traces of tears and the glint of unshed hope. "Cole, there's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice barely audible. "About my husband. About the men who chased me." He nodded, reaching for her hand, steadying her. "Whatever it is, we face it together. You don't have to carry it alone anymore." She took a deep breath and began to speak, the words spilling out in a mixture of guilt and relief. Her husband had been an honest man, but he had crossed paths with dangerous men in town, outlaws who demanded debts and loyalty that no good person could offer. When he refused, they killed him. And then they came for her, believing she knew secrets that could topple their schemes. She had fled, hiding her grief beneath courage and solitude, thinking she could outrun the past. Cole listened, every word etching deeper into his heart, yet each revelation only strengthened his resolve. He saw the truth, the love she had lost, the dangers she faced, and the fierce, unyielding strength she carried. And he knew that the choice to follow her into danger had been more than courage, it had been fate. Night deepened around them, yet in that clearing, under the stars and beside the fire, the world felt impossibly small. Clara leaned into him, allowing herself to rest for the first time in months. Cole held her, wrapping her in warmth and unspoken promises. For the first time, they allowed themselves to hope not just for survival, but for a life beyond fear, a life together. Days later, they returned to Dustwood, but not as fugitives. With careful planning, they confronted the men who had haunted Clara's past. Cole's courage, paired with Clara's cleverness and bravery, turned the tables. Justice was served, not through vengeance alone, but through careful, unwavering resolve. The outlaws were exposed, captured, or driven away, leaving Dustwood safer than it had been in years. And then, in the quiet aftermath, Clara and Cole stood atop a small hill overlooking the town. The sunset painted the sky in gold and crimson, the wine carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. She turned to him, her eyes glistening with gratitude and something deeper, a love she had almost denied herself. "You followed me," she said softly, echoing the words she had once used as a warning. "Even when I asked you not to." "Why?" Cole tipped his hat back, a small, wry smile playing on his lips. "Because sometimes love doesn't listen to reason. Sometimes it just knows. And mine knew you needed me." Tears filled her eyes, but they were tears of release, of joy, of the quiet understanding that love had found them in the midst of storms, gunfire, and fear. They embraced, not as a fleeting refuge, but as to hearts bound by courage, trust, and a shared past that had finally found peace. As night fell and the stars shimmered above the rugged horizon, the town of Dustwood slept quietly, unaware of the love stories that had been forged in its shadows. And somewhere in the wind that whispered through the canyon, it seemed to carry a simple truth: sometimes, the bravest act is following a heart that refuses to turn back. Cole held Clara close, and together, they watched the last light of day fade. The canyon below was silent, the river flowing steady and eternal. And in that moment, they understood something the storm had taught them. No past, no danger, no fear could ever diminish a love strong enough to defy it all. The night stretched wide and calm, and for the first time, they could breathe not as fugitives, not as survivors, but as two souls who had found each other in the vast, wild heart of the West, and in the distance, a lone owl called, a sentinel of the night, as if whispering to the world that some stories, forged in courage and compassion, never truly end, they echo forever. Thank you so much for joining us for this story. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more tales from the heart of the wild. We'll see you next time.